I'm going to, in a moment, just turn over to my two colleagues who are really the local experts on Cuba. I'm going to speak at you very briefly before then, but they are Rachel Price, who's sitting immediately to my right, and Rachel is a longtime friend and colleague of mine. In fact, I met her when? 1999. 1999? For the reason that when I first started to organize activities at the Social Science Research Council on Cuba, I made my first trip to Cuba in 1997. I went along with the president. I was then the president of the American Council of Learned Societies, which is the national organization in the humanities. And I went along with my friend Ken Pruitt, who was then the head of the Social Science Research Council, and with a distinguished chemist. And we managed to get a visa to go and to begin to speak to the Cubans about what might be done to establish better relations at a non-state level between the two countries, with an eye to improving relations, building trust, to a point where someday we might anticipate normalization of political relations between the two countries. So that was 1997. I have to say to you that I did not think I was going to live long enough to see what happened on December 17th of last year. So it's been, to me, an amazing not only pleasure, but surprise that we should be in this position. We'll talk more about that. Rachel came on as the first staff member to run what we call the Working Group on Cuba, which is really a tri-national committee, Cuba, US, Mexico, to administer the project, to raise private funds, to engage in activities of a wide variety of types in Cuba. We can talk about that later if you're interested. But what I hope we'll focus on today actually is both the photographs and what the photographs represent, which is the revolution. So in other words, we entitled this The Cuban Revolution as Seen from 2015. Afterwards, you want to talk about general affairs in Cuba. We have people who know a lot about that, and we can certainly do that. But I particularly wanted to bring to your attention, and you'll see in a panel from Town Topics on the walls downstairs, that there is a Princeton connection. There is always a Princeton connection. But this one is a real one, and it's actually a very interesting one, because it turns out that the Woodrow Wilson School then had a program called the American Civilization Program, which is now the American Studies Program over in McCosh Hall. And they had decided to have a conference to study revolutions, and to study three revolutions: the American Revolution, the French Revolution, and what was the third revolution? Not the Cuban Revolution, I can't even remember. But in any case, they put together in this building a group of people to hold a conference on this subject. And included among those people, by the way, was Hannah Arendt, who gave the keynote address, which turned out to be the core of her book, or the anticipation of her book on revolution, which is probably the best known book, other than the Eichmann book, that she ever wrote. And so here they were, and there was a man named Ely who lived in town, who occasionally taught here, was a Latin American specialist, who had a relationship actually to one of the revolutionaries in Cuba, and issues an invitation to Fidel Castro on his one trip in 1959 to the United States to stop. It was midway between Washington and the UN. He was going to speak to the UN, and he agreed to come here, and he did, and spent an evening here, attended this conference, gave a speech. He was accompanied by 29 Cuban newsmen, all of whom stayed for the night in the Cottage Club, and one can only imagine what that might have been like, I don't know. But there are a bunch of ephemera that have come out about this visit, but maybe someone in this room remembers. It's possible, but not someone does. Ah, so. That's right. He stayed there, but Mr. Ely was the gentleman I just referred to. Great. So there are still connections, but it was a great moment here. I was not in Princeton at that point. I was a graduate student at Harvard, and I went to the Harvard Stadium to hear Fidel speak. At least one other person was there on that occasion, so it's a living memory for quite a few of us. So that's what we hope to speak about, and we can, as I say, talk more about contemporary affairs later. But I've asked both Rachel, Rachel will lead off, actually, and then Adrian will follow up. I should say that Rachel survived me and SSRC and the working group on Cuba and went on to be a very distinguished scholar. She's a graduate of Yale as an undergraduate, at least the last 2 years. And then she went on to do a PhD in comparative literature at Duke University. And she wrote a wonderful first book called The Object of the Atlantic, Concrete Aesthetics in Cuba, Brazil, and Spain, 1868 to 1968. It was a book published almost 2 years ago now. And then this year, she published a wonderful book called Planet Cuba, which I'll leave it downstairs so that people can take a look at it. She teaches here. She's gotten tenure now. She's an associate professor in the Department of Spanish and Portuguese. She's a terrific teacher. She's a great colleague and a friend. So she'll lead off. And then our new colleague, Adrian Lopez Denis, is going to speak. He's a lecturer in the program in Latin American Studies here. And equally important, he is the resident director of our Princeton in Cuba program. We send students down for a semester. This was originally, by the way, a Woodrow Wilson School program, which I helped to start. And we sent a policy task force of students from the Woodrow Wilson School down to the University of Havana, where they took this seminar in the Center for Demography and the rest of their courses at the university. It's since been taken over by PLOS, and Adrian is administering the seminar down there. He also offers a course on contemporary Cuban history in the history department. He himself was originally trained in Havana, and he got his master's degree there in Latin American study, got a second master's at Carleton University, and his PhD in Latin American history at UCLA. So he moved to this country and did his doctoral work here. He has taught at Brown University, at the University of Delaware, and now he's teaching here at Princeton. He's also run student programs for both Brown University and Northwestern in Havana. So a lot of experience there as a scholar, but also as an administrator of educational programs. So it's a wonderfully well qualified and local panel, and I'm going to turn it over first to Rachel.
Well, first of all, thank you, Stan, for convening the panel. Thanks to David for the amazing exhibition. This was the first time I saw these photographs, and sometimes the first time I saw any of the images, and it was really eye-opening and illuminating. So first, I'd like to start off by saying that I'm not an expert on the Cuban Revolution, but the way in which I'm not an expert is also sort of telling, because I used to work on the 19th century and on the Republican period, which ends with the revolution. And the recent book that Stan was just talking about is on sort of the last 8 years since Raúl Castro took over from Fidel Castro, and it's a very post-Soviet, almost post-revolutionary moment. But the revolution is such a central event, an ongoing structure of society, that it actually bleeds both forward into the present, but also backwards, so that the revolution itself, for example, imagined the 19th century wars of independence as sort of anticipating the final liberation of the revolution. They sort of made a teleological history so that everything became about either leading up to the revolution or culminating, or the revolution sort of brought to fruition something that had been incipient before. So whether you work on the 19th century or the post-Raúl period, you end up knowing a lot more about the revolution than you ever intended to. And just thinking about some of the contemporary art that I was working on from the last few years, for example, some young artists were working on, with the reintroduction of some private enterprise, they were working on their grandparents' memorabilia from the cafes that they both owned, and which were both confiscated or closed in 1968 with the Revolutionary Front. And so these young people are bringing back memories through material culture of aspects of the revolution that maybe have been sort of sidelined for a while. So I guess I also wanted to begin by talking very briefly just about the trajectory of the revolution as I saw it being reopened in the photographic exhibition. So a lot of my students know when we do discuss the history of the revolution, but many people don't know that it didn't begin as a Marxist-Leninist revolution, but it began as a nationalist revolution, and only a couple years later was declared Marxist-Leninist. And I think something really compelling about the exhibition is it goes into some early years before the revolution and then the first years of the revolution that aren't as well known, at least here in the US, but are becoming the subject of a lot of new scholarship. So they're looking at the years of the many groups that led the kind of battles against Batista, the dictator before Fidel Castro, or also groups that fought alongside Fidel Castro and later continued to support him or turned against him, and that whole history is mapped out in the photograph. So you can even follow some of the same players who maybe in 1955 or 1957 were working on some of these clandestine movements to end Batista's dictatorship, and then you see them a few pictures and a few 5-6 years later when they've maybe broken with the revolution or gone into exile. So that's an interesting kind of trajectory that these photographs seem uniquely to capture. I also think that they capture little-known moments after the revolution of internal dissent and conflict. There's sort of years that some historians call a civil war, but again, we don't hear about it that much in the United States. Battles in the mountains, the Escambray Mountains, that's in the exhibition. Some of the groups that also don't have greater visibility, like the women's militia, are also interestingly represented in what's often depicted as a very masculinist and very militarized movement. So I think that's something that these photographs show us that slips sometimes from our common understanding. There's a new book out by a colleague, a historian named Michelle Chase, called Revolution Within the Revolution, that looks at exactly these things. It's looking at the role of women in building what would eventually become the revolution. But the book actually ends, I think, maybe in 1958, sort of 1955 to 1958. So these histories that have been either forgotten or actually squelched or sidelined after the revolution are sort of being reinvestigated. Who made the revolution? How did it come to pass? What were the different power struggles that ended up in the single narrative that we now inherit? Something else that I was really struck by looking at these pictures that again is something contemporary, it's being reopened, were the early years of nationalization. So there's a photograph, I think, of one of the petroleum processing centers. Something that maybe we forget about, but the U.S. embargo against Cuba began when some U.S. companies refused to process Soviet crude oil. And that would in turn determine a whole series of economic decisions, a turn towards the Soviet Union, exchanging Cuban sugar for Soviet petroleum. And there's this lovely image of this moment. Something that the photographs really brought up for me, and I think it's the question that all of us are asking here, is how to revisit a moment that had so many conflicting investments and so much promise and so much fear from today, knowing all the different paths that were taken and the paths that maybe were not taken have been less considered. So again, I think, how can you see these images afresh without the knowledge of what would come later? And can we see the conflicting tensions and desires in these photographs sort of without the subsequent knowledge? Or how does the knowledge that we have inform our own viewing of the images? And I just wanted to turn to sort of think about how these images are reactivated today. For example, there are negotiations going on about nationalization between the Cuban government and the US, some kind of potential new payments being made to the US companies that were expropriated or nationalized. But beyond that, I think the legacy of the revolution is really debated and debatable. And I think this kind of exhibition in some ways is more possible here than it would be in Cuba, where I'd say a young generation born maybe in the 1990s, sort of the last thing they want to think about is revisiting the stakes of the revolution. And I think that's really an open question today, is in terms of the legacy of the revolution, who's going to be invested in even debating it? Who wants to sort of move on and build their careers? Who wants to think about the history for good and for bad? And is that something that's possible in academic spaces in a way that maybe isn't as possible in everyday spaces in contemporary Cuba? So maybe just to leave it with a few open questions that this revisiting the Cuban Revolution today brings up for me is, what kind of process of reckoning are Cubans going to have as ongoing changes quicken or take different shapes? Is there going to be a kind of revisiting of this era that's been called civil war in the early years of the 1960s? Is there going to be a desire to bury differences and look for reconciliation as exiles return? Is there going to be a rewriting of history? Are there going to be new archives that are opened that give us new information? So I think these are questions that are going to continue to inform how we read the Cuban Revolution today and in the months and near future to come. So those are just some questions I'd like us to...
Thanks. Adrian.
Hello. Thank you, Stan, for the invitation. Thank you, Rachel. Thank you, Dave. The pictures are unbelievable. I'm very excited about them. And I think that, I want to continue. I promise I'm going to reckon with the Cuban Revolution. I know that you invited Cubans to do that, but I'm going to try to not do that right now. What I want to, the conversation that I want to, the direction I want to take us a little bit in has to do with the uses of memory and the role of history. And the Cuban Revolution was designed almost to be a historical event. Fidel Castro himself was very conscious of the value and importance of history. The initial moment of the Cuban Revolution, the attack of the Moncada barracks in 1953, that results in his famous defense, "History will absolve me," is already a program, not only a political program, and it is a political program, but it's also a program about history and its uses. It's almost like an attempt to not only tell the history that took Cuba to that moment, and even from that very early moment is a very teleological presentation of Cuban history, but it's also an attempt at envision what kind of history will be written about a process that has not even started yet, which is a very significant phenomenon. If you think about it from futurologist's perspective, what Fidel Castro is trying to, the kind of conversation that Fidel Castro is trying to start in 1953 had to do with what is going to happen with my legacy and my memory way into the future. And I think that the fact that the history of the revolution has been perhaps the most guarded and more controlled aspect of Cuban society, the way that the Cuban Revolution curates and produces its own history, is perhaps the most important, the center of, the core of the project is precisely this constant presentation of the history of the revolution itself, the place it plays in larger Cuban history, and more important, the legacy, the discussions that are going to happen in the future. That tells us how central the production of these, of all kinds of documents on these moments of the revolution became for the leadership. Fidel Castro put Celia Sanchez, who is depicted in these pictures, made her responsible for guarding and preserving the memory of the revolution as the revolution was unfolding. There was already a clear conscience, this is something that needs to be archived. So it was a process that was archived. Again, it started to be archived before it started to be real, and then continued to be archived throughout. And there was a clear consciousness of the importance of documenting what is going on, but also the importance of telling the story and shaping the story in a particular way, not just for political purposes. I mean, that was definitely at the core of the project, but also for larger pedagogical purposes, for trying to create a country around that narrative. So the idea was, through a series of concentric circles, not only from the events that they were themselves the protagonists, this generation wanted to build an understanding of themselves, of their political project, but also a larger understanding of the nation and the history of the nation. This is a process that is rather unique. This interest in producing and crafting the narrative that is going to define the moment as the moment unfolds, and sometimes in anticipation to future events, is a very interesting twist, let's say, in the history of social change and revolutionary change. And their journals, they all kept journals. Their journals, some of them were published immediately after. Some of the journals, more famously, the journal by Che Guevara that became a how-to manual to future guerrilla fighters. But the journals of many of the leaders were published, but many of them were also preserved, considered to be unpublishable in their basic form, and were edited, transcribed, reproduced. Sometimes even some important leaders of the Cuban Revolution were asked to write by hand again the documents that they had already written, to make sure that the changes were permanent and legitimate. More interesting, this is a fascinating chapter that is captured not in these pictures, but is captured in other pictures that could be seen in contrast with these pictures. They are much more epic than these ones. The revolutionaries realized in late 1959 that they didn't have enough footage of the revolution, and they wanted to have footage of the revolution to put together documentaries and pieces of that nature. So they did a little bit of a reenactment. They went to the mountains again, dress up, climb up, and then there was a cameraman there. Those images, of course, are not images of the actual war. They're images of a reenactment where Fidel Castro, Raúl Castro, Celia Sanchez climbed the mountains, and they were filmed. They were not misrepresenting reality. They were not saying this is footage from back in the day. They were saying this is the best we can approach to have real footage of back in the day, so that's why we did it. It was not an attempt to lie, but it was an attempt to, a necessity to have a record, a visual record that will somehow build an image, and clearly with pedagogical purposes. The goal was to use these materials as teaching tools to show, especially the younger generations, the generations to come, how and why and what and when. And I grew up with these images, again, not these images, some of these images were actually part of my visual memory. Some of them, like the one in the poster, is a very iconic one that was in every textbook and everywhere. But also images that represented the importance, that themselves spoke to the size and the importance of this event and the place it had to play in my life and my historical memory. I grew up in the, going to the Cuban school system, being basically fed all these representations and with their meanings. And one of the most beautiful things about this exhibit is that the quotes from Susan Sontag selected to establish a dialogue with the pictures remind us all the time of the nature of this process and the complexities behind any attempt at fixing meaning around any image, of course, but at the same time invite us to produce our own and find our own which is a process that we all did. In my, people from my generation growing up in Cuba, we all tried to do that somehow. We all tried to read between the lines to figure out what was going on. Many of us were fascinated with this process. We used to go camping. We used to go going on a guerrilla, which was kind of insane. But we were basically camping out in the woods. But the phrase we used was "ir de guerrilla," going on kind of basically another reenactment, no? But of a very small scale. And we pretty much played just like Indian cowboys or robbers and cops. We played the revolution. Nobody wanted to play the bad guys, so it was a little hard to get people to And playing Bay of Pigs was pretty difficult too. But we try, We try, and definitely we did this when we were kids, and there were no program sponsor projects to make kids play this way. We were basically playing this way because we were seeing these images and this footage everywhere in our early lives. Of course, a long time has passed since I was a kid in the 70s, and the kids today don't do this kind of games anymore. They play they play Batman and stuff. But we were growing up with these images that had a life in our lives. They were present in our life. They were, we're basically in dialogue with these images all the time. As we became more aware of the tricks, let's say, that documents can play, we were also more questioning. And I guess my generation, because we came of age in the middle of the perestroika and the beginning of the special period, we were particularly aware of this question of memory and image and history in the making. And we started to interrogate the past, the immediate past. We started to ask questions to our parents. And perhaps the process was happening at a less critical level, let's say, since the 60s and 70s, but in the 80s and 90s, the process acquired some urgency. We needed to have some form of some narrative that would allow us to, at the same time, understand what happened in the country before we were born, but also to understand if we were basically witnessing the end of an era and the beginning of another era, with the special period, with the crisis that came in the 90s, if we were seeing a closing and an opening, that at the time, of course, was not very clear. And this interrogation, at least in my case, in my family, brought me to a lot of these documents again, because my parents were, like many people from that generation, went to the mountains to do the campaign against illiteracy, participated in all these mobilizations, were dressed up as militias, and they're not in these pictures just because the picture, the camera was looking in a different direction, but they were one of these people at the time. And also because I then discovered that my grandfather was a fighter, first with Fidel Castro, with Gutierrez Benoyo, actually, in the Escambray Mountains against Batista, and later a fighter against Fidel Castro in the same mountains, but the second time around didn't work too well, and he was killed. So, but that was kind of something that was never discussed when I was a kid. And then when I started, to become older, I guess because, it's not something you talk to kids about, but also because the times had changed. And now we were trying to incorporate these other stories, the stories that were, postponed or marginalized, were not, couldn't fit really in the main epic narrative, and trying to incorporate these stories. So the challenge at the time for us was to find some way of moving forward at a much smaller scale than today. Today, the challenge for many Cubans that want to move forward is basically how to tell a story or write a history that is comprehensive enough, that incorporates enough perspectives and incorporates enough players, a history that Cubans that live in Cuba and Cubans that don't live in Cuba, Cubans that agree with the policies of the government, and Cubans that don't disagree, all of them see themselves represented there. And of course, the way to do this is to go back to the materials. I'm a historian, I kind of believe in that stuff. To go back to the materials, to the original documents, and show more of them, show more sides of the stories. And those sides are there. We can find them now. We now have the ability to recognize characters and to identify complex phenomena and to deal with much more politically convoluted narratives, so we can do justice to the complexity of the past of the revolution in ways that before were not available. And the way to start doing this is precisely to take the entire record. And one of the things that these pictures do very well is that they present many sides of the revolutionary moment. And I've seen several attempts at representing these moments. The official history as taught by the Cuban Museum of the Revolution, for example, would be a way you could establish a strong contrast between that and these pictures, because only show you one side of the story. They definitely try to minimize any reference to things that could be considered controversial, like political prisoners or executions. Seeing that the government, although at the time they did it, they felt that they had a lot of popular support for them, and probably they did. Although at those times, there were stories that they could have highlighted in the press, and they did. And now they don't want those stories to be too central to the narrative they're presenting, and they'd rather don't mention it or mention it in passing. But we can now put them at the center again and make sure that people that have an emotional connection to this part of the narrative see themselves there too, and see their stories there too. And at the same time, that doesn't mean to erase the history of the revolution in the sense of to erase the epic or to erase the revolutionary moment, because if we do that, we not only misrepresent the moment, but we also are then unable to understand why people have been committed to a project like this for so long, how much people are really invested, and why they're so invested. And so the challenge of presenting a narrative that includes multiple sides and that tries to do justice to the complexity of the moment, and that can give everyone that has something at stake, not only Cubans, because this is a global moment. There's many people from all over the world that also have a legitimate emotional connection to this moment, that everyone can see some of what makes that connection real there. Creating that record and creating those exhibits and presenting this type of memory is going to be a challenge for historians and curators of the future. And it's already a challenge right now. I took a group of alumni to Bay of Pigs. No, sorry, they were already going to Bay of Pigs. I just went with them. And we went to the museum there. And it's a fascinating museum because it's a museum of the Bay of Pigs invasion, but it's also a museum of the aesthetics and the perspective of 1972 or something, that is when it was created, and it has not been changed since then, which is in itself a very interesting testimony of how the revolution deals with memory. They were really invested in it, but there's some parts of the historical memory of the revolution itself that they don't feel that they can work with anymore. They have left alone. And this is a very iconic moment in a very iconic place. And it's still very unsophisticated in terms of how it is presented, and it's pretty much frozen in time. It's a museum, really, it's a museum of the 1970s in Cuba, more than a museum of the 1960s. And so I really don't have a main point here. I'm trying to basically get you to think a little bit about what we can do with complex archives and why they are so important, and why they need to be seen more and explored more and talked about more. And this little exhibit here is a wonderful sample of what we can do with what we already have, and also kind of a little bit of a promise of what is going to start popping up as we continue this journey. And putting Cuba in the news, of course, is going to create all kinds of offers, things that people are going to take things from their closets and their attics, hopefully. And hopefully also the institutions, American and Cuban institutions and Russian institutions, are going to start opening their archives and showing us their dirty secrets and their papers and their pictures, I hope. Thank you.
Well, thanks to both of you. I want to make one comment that I meant to make before I hadn't. Going back to the conference that was held here, because it wasn't in this building. This building wasn't built. I suppose it was at 5 Ivy Lane, but I'm not sure. Does anybody know where the conference was? McCosh? McCosh 50? Maybe. Yeah, well, that was later, though. I'm not sure the conference was there, but okay. In any case, the third revolution, of course, was the Russian Revolution. Those are the three revolutions she was talking about. But Castro is reported as having made some really interesting comments here on the general question of revolution. So I think it's relevant to us. The conference was called the United States and the Revolutionary Spirit. And he said, as reported, that the Cuban Revolution had ended two myths about revolution in 20th century Latin American history. One, it had shown that a revolution was able to defeat a professional army possessing modern weapons, and everybody said that couldn't be done. And secondly, that it had shown, and this is more interesting in a way, it had shown it was possible to create a revolution when people weren't hungry. Think about that for a moment. So that was Castro's position at that time on his revolution, because the argument he made was that the Cuban Revolution was more a moral revolution, a political revolution against a corrupt dictatorship than it was an uprising of the poor against the rich, that classic sort of Soviet vision, 1917 vision of a revolution. He said that his revolution, he said, had been supported by 95% of the people, generating what he called a unanimity of opinion, and he said that had never happened in Cuban history before. And then, in a way more interesting to me, he argued strongly to the crowd that in thinking about the three revolutions, it was important to understand that the Cuban Revolution wasn't like the French Revolution. It was not what he called a 1789 revolution, and it wasn't a 1917 revolution. It was a 1776 revolution. It was really much more like the American Revolution. Given that, and that it was important in America, in the United States, for us to think about that, because it suggested ways in which we could continue to collaborate with a revolutionary Cuba, which, since it was a revolution against foreign domination, was to that extent very on the American model. And there was a basis for going forward between the two countries. And it's rather poignant to think back on that. And for those of us who are my age or older, of course, one of the things we remember, I think, most prominently about that was that Fidel Castro did not present himself, indeed, I don't think he was a communist, in 1959. And there's a lot of debate in this country about the promise of the revolution. There was a lot of resentment against the kind of regime that he had overthrown, and tremendous, I think, sympathy in this country for what looked like a democratic, anti-totalitarian revolution in Cuba. It didn't take too long for Castro's position to change and for the perception of the revolution in this country and elsewhere to change. But reading back about this, I was really fascinated by it. And it brought me back to my own first impression when I heard Castro speak in '59. I was full of hope. I thought that this really was the harbinger of good things, indeed, in the Western Hemisphere. So all of that is it's evocative for me, and possibly it is for you. But both of the speakers have really stressed also the role of memory, Adrian, the role of history, and he mentioned the two primary museums you're likely to see if you go to visit, and I know many of you have been to visit Cuba. The Museum of the Revolution in Havana and the Bay of Pigs, the tiny little museum at the Bay of Pigs. And these are both by American standards. I hope you'll agree with me, pretty primitive. And it speaks partly to the poverty of the country. It's really expensive to put together what we consider a proper museum, although the Cubans have done it with respect to modern Cuban art. And the Museum of Modern Cuban Art is as fine a museum as you'll see in the Western Hemisphere. But it's not true of the Museum of the Revolution, I think. I'm interested in your take on it. But it reminds me more, actually, of museums in China or not the new ones, but the ones going back 30 years or so. And that's interesting, too, in terms of they really haven't updated. Partly, I think that's a matter of expense. Partly, I think it's what Adrian referred to before, and that is coming to terms with what you think the revolution is at any particular point in time. And we all know, many of us know the ways in which our own revolution has changed in terms of the way that we commemorate it. So all of those are things that I think we might talk about. So I'm going to open the floor, and I'd ask you to identify yourself, and if your question is for a particular person, please direct it to that person. And before he leaves, I'm going to blow the whistle on Miguel. Just wave. Okay. Because I wanted to mention that one thing I forgot initially. Miguel and I offered a course about 10 years ago, maybe it was 12 years ago here, a policy task force in the Woodrow Wilson School, an undergraduate task force. And the title for that task force was Cuba After Castro. And what we asked our students, we had 12 juniors or 10 juniors, I think, in that course, was to think what was going to happen on the day, we weren't thinking about Raul in those days, on the day Fidel Castro walked out the door. And they wrote some very interesting papers and wrote a report on all that. And now that's in sight. I mean, Fidel Castro has walked out the door, more or less. Raul has announced that in 2018, he will walk out the door. And given life, who knows whether it's even 2018. Whatever else is true, there won't be somebody named Castro running the country in 2019, which doesn't mean, of course, that it won't be Castro's Cuba and Castro's revolution, and that's one of the things we might talk about. So with that, I really want to open it up and simply ask what questions you have and tell us who you are. Try to make it a question. Okay. Yeah, there are microphones. It'll be best if you come down.
For Adrian, when you were growing up, were you aware of the Soviet Union and its influence on Cuba?
Sorry,
Can you
I was
hear-
aware of what?
Of the Soviet Union and its influence and on Cuba?
I'm going to speak without the microphone. I think, can you hear me back there?
Yes.
Okay. Oh, this is on. Okay, good. I just came from teaching, so I have that kind of desire to yell, I guess. The Soviet Union was everywhere growing up. I mean, the Soviet Union was not an invisible presence by any means. It was, there's a lot of recent scholarship about how much of my generation is marked by nostalgia for Soviet culture, which is, the cartoons were very important for us. The cartoon on TV, we would watch, we'd come from school just like kids everywhere. Mom and dad would let us watch cartoons for a little bit. And the cartoons we would watch in many of us in all American TVs, because at the time the Russians and Cuban TVs were not around yet. So we, at least in my small town, I watched Russian cartoons in an old General Electric TV from the 50s and in the 70s. And those cartoons were, sometimes they were not even translated or dubbed. So some of them were in Russian, some of them were in Hungarian or in Czech, and they were just, little animals hitting each other with things on the heads and stuff like that. They were not very profound, but they were. We all remember the songs and the images because it's whatever is important for you when you're a kid. And so in the media, it was present. In the material culture, of course, the imports, food, appliances, they were all very funny. And they all had the Russian names on them in Russian that we couldn't read. Although some people could, because Russian was offered as an option in the school. You could study either Russian as a second language or English as a second language. And of course, all the cool kids, we chose English because it was like the cool language. And now I regret it because, I could have been reading Dostoevsky or, if I had taken Russian and I didn't learn too much English, as you can see, in this Cuban school system. But it was a vivid presence. And also in my neighborhood in particular, there were a place, the Russian village, that they call it, that there were several of those enclaves. In my case, it's because I live very close to the Lourdes station, radio station, and satellite station. There was a place built by the Russians in Cuba to intercept phone calls from the United States and listen to phone calls. It's now a huge school for training computer scientists, but it used to be a spy station. And the people that manage the station have a small barrio near my house, very interesting little village. And so the men would go to work because they were all soldiers, officers, and the women would go to trade to the other towns to trade condensed milk for coffee, and so we learned all about the black market from the Russian moms that would go around trading, just like they did in Russia at the time. So we had that kind of exposure. My cousin is a little older than me. He went to study in the Soviet Union in the 1985, and in 1989 they were trying to send them back to Cuba when they started closing all these programs of study. But he stayed there. He now lives in the Ukraine and in Kiev, and he's been there since then. He never came back, and so he barely speaks Spanish. When we speak on the phone, it's like half Russian, half Spanish. He's been there way too long, and so he, a lot of kids went to study, in the Soviet Union. I was just shy of getting into one of those programs because they were closed when I was studying in the university. But my older cousin, older than him, became a pilot and flies one of those scary Russian planes. And I studied in the Soviet Union again, reading Russian all the time. So it's still very present, and it's still very vivid. There's a lot of people that speak Russian and that now are working with Russian tourists. There are Russian tourists everywhere. New wealthy Russian tourists that come to Havana. Some of them fueled also by stories and nostalgia of their parents that went to Havana back in the days of the revolution, of their close relationship between the Soviet Union and Cuba. And now they are going there to see where their parents used to go to the beach and all of that. And so, it's still pretty vivid and present. And we joke about it a lot. We make fun of the Russians. I think it's a huge cultural difference. And Cubans, we are all very mean. So we make fun of Russians because they were different from us, basically. We made fun of Russian kids that were in the school with us. They would put skills, some of the kids in the Russian, and some of the Russian kids in the school with us, and we would make fun and pick on them because they were different and funny. And, it was very mean. But that's how I grew up, with this image of the Russians as, really a presence. I never saw them as an occupying force or anything like that. They were not, to begin with. But also, that side was very difficult to see. You would never see like Russian soldiers going around with weapons, for example. You would see Russian soldiers, sometimes in uniform, but rarely armed, or, sometimes you would see the Russian tanks going by because there was a factory that fixed tanks near my town. So they would come by at night and you would hear them and see them. But, it was not a very threatening or a scary presence. It was just, kind of funny guys running around, walking around. Yeah. And they had great condensed milk and canned meat and all those good stuff, and apple juice.
Thanks. Other questions?
Pinpoint the watershed event or series of events that down the road of normalization?
You go first.
It's interesting, I'll just say before speculating that the question of watersheds is sort of a popular pastime in thinking about the Cuban Revolution anyway, right? So there's moments, again, thinking about when it went this way or that way, and people sort of talk about their disillusionment with the revolution, they date that to different moments and different key events. So it's a kind of a very common form of thinking about the Cuban Revolution is when did it start becoming like this or that. In terms of normalization, I mean, I know there's a series of paintings, for example, the handshake between Obama and Raul in South Africa, which is that 2009? I don't remember the date, actually. That handshake was supposed to be very important. People really interpreted it in many different ways. I have to say that those of us who work on Cuba in the months before normalization, we'd heard rumors about Cuba being taken off the list of terrorist nations, and we'd also noticed the weekly columns in the New York Times about Cuba, and we're saying, what's going on? But there was, in my mind, there was no leaking of any kind of anticipation. I think for most of us, it was a total surprise. Yeah. What do you think?
Well, we were having dinner in my place, actually, before December 17, but it was already in December. It was in early December last year, I think. And we were talking about what was the fact that it was clear that something was going on because of the weekly editorials of the New York Times. I was telling Rachel, I think that Cuba is going to be taken out of the list of states that support terrorism, and that's going to happen soon. And so I assumed that would be the announcement being made, and I wasn't expecting that much. But I was, it was clear at the end of December, mid-December, let's say, early December, that something was cooking. The editors of the New York Times had insisted that they were not part of anything, and this is just a coincidence, and perhaps it is. But for us, for many people that work on Cuba or are obsessed with Cuba, those were clear signs of something that was going on. And again, you see whatever you want to see, I guess. And we were very hopeful. But I think that the moment, the clear moment of change for me at least, the one that I was able to witness in Havana, was the moment that Obama became president. When Obama became president, a lot of the commentaries in Cuba were about this is going to be the beginning of a new chapter. No? And I mean, people were expecting immediate, like the week after, changes, radical changes. Of course, that didn't happen. But I think that this is the moment in which a lot of people started to think seriously about that possibility. No? And people were getting nervous as the second Obama presidency was, going to end, basically, that no major change on Cuba policy was there. Although there were some changes in Cuba policy with Obama, some of them very early in the first presidency, but not radical major change. And a lot of people were celebrating the victory of Obama in Cuba for many reasons. But the idea of normalization was already there, was already in the minds of the general public. I don't think that there was anything going on. And then we had a moment in 2008 where people were talking about the possibility of a white paper circulating between the two governments. It was something that was commented a lot upon. I guess it was not a very good white paper because you're not supposed to know about those, or perhaps it didn't exist. But there were already talks in 2008 of documents being exchanged frequently between representatives of both governments, but I don't know if there's any truth to that. I would say the moment that I saw the conversation spiking and then kind of dying out was the moment of the inauguration of Obama in the first presidency. That was kind of the key moment there. And I mean, maybe we can see this as the beginning of a process of some sort.
Yeah, let me just comment quickly. If you want to read about it, this is the book you want to read. It's called Back Channel to Cuba, and it's written by Bill Leo Grande and Peter Kornblue from American University. It's called The Hidden History of Negotiations Between Washington and Havana. But you don't want the hardbound edition because the new paperback edition has a new last chapter, because this book was published before December of 2014, and the last chapter is, I think, the best account yet of the actual negotiations. And what's important about that really is they really were secret negotiations. I mean, 18 months of secret negotiations, mainly hosted by the Canadians. And the Canadians were crucial in this, and then in the last stages, really sponsored by the Vatican, the Pope Francis was a crucial player in all of this. They were kept very quiet. I think almost no one in our government actually knew what was happening. So from that point of view, it's enormously, exciting and I think surprising development. But if one wants to be cynical about it, and I'm a little cynical about it, and you ask what is the single reason that brought particularly Cuba to the table, I think it'd be reasonable to say it's the drop in the price of oil, because it has been Venezuelan support replacing the Soviets for energy and other things in Cuba that made really the economic survival of the regime possible. And it began to look as though that wasn't going to be possible. It's what has led, I think, to the revolution, the election this past Sunday in Venezuela. But we can talk about that separately. But the Leo Grande book is really terrific, and you should read that if you're interested in all of this. So other questions, please. Said.
First is, I was wondering if you could say something about the legacy while you were growing up, and perhaps still today, for young Cubans, of Che Guevara. You could talk a little bit about what he meant for when you were young, and what, if you know about what he means for young people today. And also about the Angolan war. So I've read Adrian Lopez Denis' account of the Angolan war, which of course is very laudatory and so forth, but what was it like at the time? During that time, and also what legacy it has today.
Okay. So basically, Che Guevara serves two major purposes for my generation. Part of my generation bases their support, the continuous support for some of the main ingredients, let's say, of the revolutionary recipe that was put in place in 1959, through an emotional connection with Che Guevara, which is easier to establish, among other things, because Che Guevara disappeared from the picture relatively early. And so Che Guevara could be used to preserve a certain moment that has not been contaminated by future developments, no? And it can be used for that purpose. But more interestingly, it has been used also to reappropriate the concept of revolution itself, which is, it has been used as a symbol, particularly by many contemporary culture producers, artists, musicians, to retake control of the question of revolution itself. In my own life, I'm a reformist, which makes me a counter-revolutionary by default, because those are the two options in Cuba, in terms of the Cuban Revolution, but also makes me some sort of weird supporter of the current process, because this is a reform, and if I want to be consistent with this, I had to kind of be on board on what's going on now in Cuba. And Che Guevara is not a good sign, a good symbol for reformists. This is the problem, with Che Guevara, that it's not very useful for people that want to implement a slow, very methodical changes as opposed to revolutionary changes. No? So my generation, I think that there were a lot of people in my generation and younger that are very interested in questions of social change, although we're not very political in the classic sense, but that the ones that are revolutionaries, either because they define it as a support of the Cuban Revolution or because they define it as we want to change what is going on right now really fast, those are two different definitions, but very consistent of what revolution means in Cuba. They will feel closer to Che Guevara as a symbol, but people that are more like, we need to avoid the excesses of radical change because we already had an experience like that in '59, and what we want to do is to preserve as much as possible whatever is already in place that works. Then Che Guevara is not too much of it doesn't appeal too much to this type of people, no? That's on Che Guevara. What was the question, Angola war? I mean, again, this is a generational question too. My generation lived through this conflict in many different ways. There were many of my friends that went to Angola, fought in Angola. In my case, when I was about to start university, they would ask you to sign a form saying that you were willing to go to Angola, and I didn't sign the form. I said I didn't want to go to Angola, and they said, well, you're not going to be able to start in the university. Of course, it was not true. I mean, they pushed that pressure, they put pressure on you to sign, but if you didn't sign, nothing really happened. We're talking about the late 80s. So, you know, it was not really a big deal. I felt like I was doing something civic and important, but it was not. It was just basically a silly bureaucratic thing. But a lot of my friends did sign, and some of my friends went to Angola and fought in the war. And we saw this war. I mean, many of people in my generation saw this war with a lot of the complexity the event actually had. Some people actually believed that they were doing something important and useful for changes in Africa that were in turn world changes. Some people believed that they were participating in the liberation of Angola and Namibia and the end of the apartheid and presented it to themselves like that. And other people digested the Angola war in terms very similar to the Vietnam War in the United States. This was our Vietnam War, you know. And like everything, when you compare anything that happens in the 80s with anything that happened in the 70s, what happened in the 80s looks very funny. You know, it's like a bad version of whatever happens in the 70s. It happens in music and everything, hairdos. And we also had our attempt at living this as the Vietnam War, but it was not. It was difficult to live it as a Vietnam War. I mean, in the sense of the young people felt that they were forced to go to place to fight a war that they didn't want to fight on. A lot of people felt that way. A lot of people felt also there was a racial component to this, which is a very complicated racial component because the Cuban government wanted to have an army that was mostly Afro-Cuban because they wanted to avoid the perception of being seen as another white intervention in Angola, in Africa. But at the same time, that means that a lot of people that died in Angola and went through trauma as a result of the war were Afro-Cubans that were also disproportionately less favored by history and then by the revolution and then by the war. So it's a conflict that is still lingering a lot. Cuba sent 250,000 people to fight there, which for the size of the country, this is the only other country in the hemisphere that has sent people across the Atlantic to fight in a war. And this is, that also means that there's a lot of veterans in Cuba of that war still because they were very young, 17, 18, 19, 20, the soldiers. So those veterans are playing an important role in Cuban society today. They have a level of maturity and an intensity of experiences that many other people don't have. And they're not clear. You cannot reduce them to some political position or ideology. They're very complex individuals, of course. But the fact that Cuba has an army that has veterans in large numbers explains, for example, why the Cuban government started the reforms early on by giving positions to these veterans in the new emerging mixed enterprise as a way to keep these people in, first because they trust many of these people to be responsible, et cetera, but also to give them something to do that would keep them off the streets and off the troublemaking. So, which is, I think, has been a very smart way to manage the veterans. There's many other ways to manage veterans that are not as productive as this. Yes, sir.
As a retired Latin American historian, I spent some time in Cuba finally last January. About 2 weeks, we went there with one of the companies in the U.S. that takes you down. And after many, many years of wanting to go, I finally got a chance to go. And it was very interesting. I was very impressed. And in other ways, I was very disappointed. But when I came back, I read an interesting know if you both read that book, what your impressions were of Ada's take from the revolution or take from his memoir, his memories of Cuba.
You want to talk about Carlos here?
I've never actually read the book. I mean, I'll just answer briefly because I haven't read the book, though I know about the book, and I was once asked to bring a copy of the book to somebody in Cuba who was interested in alternative histories. My impression of his positions is that he's very, he's got a particular take, which is, I guess, his own biographical take, and maybe it's not one that allows for the multiple histories we were talking about maybe being particularly interesting right now, but I haven't read it, so.
I want to make sure that we're referring to the same book. Is Waiting for the Snow in Havana?
Yes.
Yes, because he had a second memoir that he just published more recently that is about Miami and his life there. Yeah. Okay. Oh, you said you read the second one then? No, I read the first one. Okay. Yeah, Waiting for the Snow in Havana is a book that is becoming more important for people that want to understand Cuba now that when it was published. It's one of those rare books that I read more attentively later when things settle a little bit. And again, when I'm thinking about the possibilities of recovering a multiple memory, I'm not thinking about creating some sort of, ink blood that everybody can see themselves there, but that have no meaning. That's not necessarily what I'm thinking about. I don't want to produce a neutral and neutralized history of the revolution so everybody can see their own past there. I want to be able to sustain complex narrative with multiple perspectives that can coexist, just like this exhibit is doing with these pictures. That is not an attempt to tell a story and exclude the other stories. It's an attempt to tell multiple stories at many levels and keep you thinking and wondering and trying to find your own place within these complex narratives. And in this case, the memoir by Ada, I think, is one of the building blocks it's going to be one of the building blocks of this type of projects. We need more narratives like that. We need more of these very much personally infused presentations of the past from every perspective, because it's not going to be enough. We are right now trying to see the Cuban Revolution from the perspective of contemporary political anthropology and trying to redefine what the revolution was, who did this. For example, one thing that we need to stop doing, I think at some point we're going to have to stop doing, is calling it the Castro Revolution. The revolution, Castro made the revolution his revolution, but the revolution was not his revolution. That was a process in itself. The process of the revolution becoming Castro's revolution is a process of reduction in itself. It's a process of selective memory. It's a process of exclusions. And so, again, redefining the revolution, rethinking it, and understanding better the Cuba that preceded the revolution, the Cuba of the 50s, is going to be, for years to come, it's going to be, at least I think from a point of view, a very fun project to engage in, but also it's going to be a very much needed project if we want to move forward in any meaningful way. We cannot move forward by forgetting. We can only move forward by remembering better. This is not about erasing the past. It's not about reconciliation that is obtained through silence. It's about finding each other as mature political subjects in a future that has multiple versions of its past and can contain them all, which is a much more challenging process than just erasing or writing an epic. But it's something that will help us become politically more mature, because we don't have in Cuba too much of the political experience that comes with the practice of standard politics, let's say party politics, democracy, whatever you want to call it. And so, but we need to come up with something fast. We need to come up with a crash course to acquire that kind of maturity, and perhaps doing these historical exercises could be useful in terms of producing more complex, more sophisticated political subjects for the future.
Great, thank you. Please. It's an interesting moment. Some of you I know have recently been to Cuba, and there's a real question whether this is a transition or it is a transition of some sort. But exactly what sort of transition is still, I think, very much open to question. And the reason is that a lot depends upon what this regime, Raul Castro's government, decides to do and how they respond at this moment. In classic terms of thinking back to '89, there's a question of whether perestroika is an option in Cuba. Right now, the administration doesn't think it is. It's not clear to what extent they think glasnost is an option either. What is clear is that they know that the economy doesn't work and that they have to begin to adapt in some ways. And the accommodation with the United States is the most important first step, I think, toward that. But it's only a first step. Over the last few years, they have announced various kinds of steps toward market reform. They have, of course, made no steps toward political reform at all, and I don't think at the moment they don't intend to do that. My own take on it is that what they want to be is a little bit pregnant, and I think that's a condition contrary to the fact. So I think at some point they're going to have to make a decision whether they engage in market reform or not. But as you say, the specter, and they're very aware of this, the specter before them is one of Eastern Europe and the Soviet Union for that matter. And the question is what's to be lost by a too rapid transition to capitalism and a market. They're aware that inequality, which is already occurring, is a problem in every country that's gone through that process, and that democratic political behaviors don't necessarily come out the other end either. So I would say they're exquisitely aware of the Eastern European model. They're also aware of the Vietnamese and Chinese models. And certainly they have thought in terms of economics in particular of the possibilities of free market socialism. But they haven't moved in that direction, really. So my take on it is that the jury is out because they haven't made a political commitment yet on what the longer-term transition is going to look like. And I think those of us who care are watching that very carefully. But they're very well aware, partly because Adrian made the point, so many of them are educated in Eastern Europe. They speak the languages. They've followed that very carefully. They're less aware, but certainly now, the economists, for instance, we've been sending Cuban economists to China and Vietnam for 10 years. So they know what's happening there. They know that option. What they're going to do about it is not at all clear to me. So, for those of us who care, it's a really interesting moment, but I would say that it's very difficult to know the direction.
Watching over Cuba, because moment,
Well,
learning from other countries is helpful, and in fact, China is a good model where capitalism has developed while there is still a centralized government, and it seems that that's the way, I guess.
well, we'll see. But at any rate, it's a great question, and I thank you for it. So I thank you all for coming, and I want to thank Adrian and Rachel. And I particularly want to thank David Sellers, so we can thank him again. And now please join us downstairs.